All right, so hi everyone. Welcome to the short seminar about Green Debate Open, primarily discussing ways in which the environment or nature could factor into parliamentary debate. So the first thing that is relevant especially in debates about climate change and debates about the environment is to have a good picturization essentially of the status quo. What this means is that we have to really know what's going on and how long it's been going on. Obviously, it is a known fact that climate change is a reality of today's world, and there are diminishing of certain regions, for instance, the North Pole. What is relevant to note here is that this is something that's been occurring over like hundreds of years, but something that's only been rapidly occurring and rapidly progressing only the past few decades with the rise of things like the Industrial Revolution, with the rise of things like the like increased levels of production, increased levels of pollution, right? So climate change has been exacerbated, and it's reached a point where there are hypotheses to say that it is ultimately irreversible. So that is obviously the reality of today, and how climate change have been diminishing, even like changing the scope of the world, like diminishing of things like the North Pole. What this does is that there's also a lot of health concerns that is related. So we're not just talking about the environment progressing or degressing in a way that is ultimately harmful and could quite literally cause human extinction, primarily harming species. But there's also a lot of human health complications being involved, right? So there's a lot of associations with, say, cardiovascular diseases, respiratory issues from like toxic air waste and things like that. And it's a lot more, things like a lot more frequent heavy rains would affect kidney. So this is primarily occurring in areas that have indigenous populations that are normally occurring in places that are quite neglected by government regulation. And it's also occurring in poor areas or very slum areas where it's where the flow of, say, corporate waste goes to. There are also sinking islands and rising sea level, namely in archipelagos, so namely in very island type countries. Obviously, you also experience things like rising sea levels, which means that there is a threat towards the very existence of certain land areas, or the shrinking of certain land areas, primarily because there isn't really like a lot of emphasis being placed on taking care of dumping waste in the water, for instance, right? So rising sea levels is a reality of environmental damage, primarily caused by the fact that there isn't enough regulation surrounding that. And then obviously also the risk of demolition of property. So for instance, when we're talking about property, it's very broad, right? When we're talking about landslides, it also affects man-made property. We're also talking about forest fire, which primarily affects the ecosystem, right? So a lot of these things, or the demolition of property, the changing of landscapes, are basically both causes and effects of climate change. And a lot of it is man-made. A lot of it is also a result of toxic waste and stuff like that. And therefore it becomes the reality of the status quo. From this, the reality is obviously incredibly dire, but it is something that builds up slowly and over time and have been building up a lot more rapidly, which means that regulation and a lot of the setback towards climate change would also have to be built up quite rapidly, given the current effects, right? Okay, so the types of discussions in debate of climate change and of environmental based topics in general is actually quite broad, and it doesn't get discussed enough in debates, right? We're talking about the efficacy of domestic policies to slow down the effects of climate change. For instance, things like taxation or CO2 emissions, the planting of more trees, for instance, right? All these things are sort of like efficacies of domestic policies that almost slow down the effects of climate change. It could be a topic of discussion of whether or not it solves climate change in its entirety, or whether or not these policies actually work, right? But these are some of the things that are discussed a lot, especially in terms of compliance, in terms of whether or not companies will comply with the requirement, for instance, to, you know, to pay taxation, pay a certain amount of taxation, or things like that. Secondly is stuff like obligations of certain countries to enter into or sign international agreements like the Paris Agreement, Iran nuclear deal, arguably an environmental concern regulation, maybe not, but it's things like this that are also sort of the obligations of certain countries. It's also a topic of discussion in debates. So when we're talking about this, we're also talking about whether or not countries should sign into, for instance, the US got a lot of backlash to not signing the Paris Agreement, right? The arguments being, well, every single country, especially someone as big and rich as US and a country that contributes that much to global emission standards or global emissions and greenhouse gases and stuff like that, should probably sign the Paris Agreement or sign an international agreement that agrees to take care of the environment for us. With this being said, it's there is also the argument that it is a collective responsibility. So no matter how big or small the country is, whatever you're doing leaks into other countries and therefore isn't something that you bear the brunt yourself. And therefore there should be a global type agreement. So these are the types of debates about whether or not there is an obligation actually for countries to enter into agreement. This is quite prevalent in a lot of debates. Obviously, there are also discussions about the existence of either an individual or collective moral responsibility, as stated before, which influences a lot of debates about like international agreements or obligations of countries. But it also leads into other discussions, right? Like assigning an inherent value to nature or the environment. Because to the extent that there is an individual moral responsibility towards the environment, then presumably it's also believed that there is an inherent value in the environment or in nature itself, whether or not it provides prosperity for like mankind or for humans, right? So individual obligation include discussions of whether or not mass change in climate patterns should always be the end goal. Obviously, if we're talking about what you're doing as an individual, it would not make a massive impact towards the environment and the globe in general, but it does fulfill an individual moral responsibility when you do see that the environment has an inherent value. Lastly, there are obviously also a lot of intersectional themes in discussions about the environment. Topics may refer to areas like Marxism, which is very leftist in its approach to eco debates, or capitalism, for instance, or economic structures, or labor, etc. Right? So, a lot of these things are sort of tied towards discussions about the environment, especially when it comes to debates, and could be potential new directions to explore. All right. Another thing that is obviously also relevant when we're talking about debating what should be possible or potential solutions towards the environment are discussions about stakeholders, right? So who are the people who should be taxed? Who are the people who should be prioritized, or who are the people who are hurt the most surrounding like climate change, surrounding things that other people profit massively from? One of the most important stakeholders probably to discuss are like companies or corporations, because it is from the start the Industrial Revolution that actually perpetuated or rapidly contributed to climate change or the degradation of nature, right? So the idea behind this is that it is production and overproduction and the monetization and the peak of capitalism that made our earth a lot more degraded. So companies are always an important stakeholder almost in every debate about environmental regulation, or almost in any debate that has anything to do with how you can approach or view or achieve better environment. So how companies will respond is also obviously a big topic of discussion, because even though we can assign responsibility to companies, it's not always the case that they will abide by those assigning of responsibilities, but also the goals of the government about extraneous goals, like economic goals, for instance, prohibiting tax evasion, stuff like that, that would be accounted for in any debate that talks about regulating companies, right? Poor people or poor populations is also obviously a very important topic of discussion, but also racial minorities like indigenous groups most of the time are the people who are considered poor populations, although those two aren't necessarily the same thing, right? For the most part, by and large, of course, it still has to be proven. It cannot just be a fact or an assertion, but for the most part, it is like poor populations or indigenous groups who are mostly bearing the brunt or bearing the hurt of climate change, right? Because as stated before, it is indigenous groups whose land is mostly neglected by the government, and a lot of toxic waste are dumped into these lands that people don't really care about or don't have a lot of commercial value. And a lot of times it is also poor population. It's their labor that's being utilized by big companies. And it's those people who don't really have enough to pay for health repercussions when they do experience health repercussions from climate change or from like toxic air. Governments are obviously a very important role or stakeholder because they're the ones who enact policies. They're the ones who kind of weigh out what could and could not be efficacious. International bodies, also very important. We're talking about the UN, we're talking about international agreements, and we're also talking about international organizations, whether it is government or non-governmental, that ultimately band together other governments or band together a level of awareness from the rest of the world in order to achieve some form of environmental change, right? Individuals, obviously, in debates about, like, say, even veganism or in debates about, like, individual choice and individual action is very important. Individuals play, obviously, a large role in debates about, in debates about climate change, right? In debates about what you should do as a person, even though your actions might not manifest as something that big. And lastly, our organizations, mostly I'm talking about NGOs, who play a very large role in doing the extra work, who are picking up the extra work that a lot of times governments are not able to do because they are abided by corporate lobbyists, for instance, right? So these are just some of the stakeholders that are normally, for the most part, discussed in environmental debates. Obviously, there are going to be a lot more other stakeholders that would largely depend on the motion. All right, lastly, it's important to talk about domestic solutions, right? Taxation or dealing with air climate is a very, it's one of the most common, one of the most popular domestic solutions. The idea here is that if you have to pay more for contributing to environmental degradation, you would get taxed or not pay more. You would have to pay more in order to have that luxury or privilege to produce whatever you produce without minding what is the effect towards the environment. Straight up banning of certain wasteful products like plastic straws, already done in a lot of states in the US, already done in a lot of countries around the world and in a lot of regions. Less production of plastic straws, less production of plastic in general, primarily because plastic is non-degradable, right? So it doesn't really, it's contributing to less biodiversity, it's contributing to species dying, and that's ultimately bad for the environment. Biodiversity efforts, there are a lot of domestic solutions, such as the introduction of non-native species into wildlife, or the introduction of a lot of, or protection of like endangered animals, for instance, is something that is very much prioritized in any country. The idea here is that there are a lot of culture that's tied towards biodiversity efforts. So when we're talking about preserving the environment, we're also talking about preserving, say, like culture, right? And what is unique to each country. Investment into green technology and renewable energy is also something that is a popular topic of discussion, and is increased. Like it's one of the many domestic solutions that's being explored, right? So as far as we admit that as people we have certain needs, such as transportation and usage of cars, there is a lot more research being done into less emission cars, such as Tesla, or more green cars, fossil fuel replacement, finding alternative ways to fulfill your daily needs without really passing policies that would be wildly unpopular amongst the public. So these alternatives are what makes domestic solutions a lot more efficacious, right? The protection of land through regulation is also something that is being discussed a lot as a domestic solution. So things like banning forest fires, things like banning mining, things like protection even of certain indigenous lands as sacred land or like national property. Those are all things that are ultimately contributing towards domestic solutions for battling climate change. These efforts don't normally pass one by one. They are normally manifesting in collective bills. For instance, the Green New Deal is something that is specifically tackling climate change, right? It also tackles things like taxation of like large corporations and are oftentimes like party oriented. These bills or these very eco-friendly bills normally run on a more leftist platform, primarily because it is anti-corporation, which is normally a rightist platform, right? It makes it more likely that there is an inclusion then of environmental regulation in these campaign platforms, or more left-leaning campaign platforms, simply because it abides a lot more to the stakeholders that they are more associated to. So these are just some things that could be relevant in debates about the environment, in debates about about protection of the environment. And hopefully there will be more discussions, more complex discussions about how we could tackle climate change.